tensions escalating on the Texas border.
This morning, new concerns on the southern border.
Nearly 10,000 migrants a day.
There's a humanitarian crisis at the border.
U.S. and Texas officials continue to clash over how to deter them.
To expand our border security capabilities, we are building a new Texas Military Department base camp.
It's a sad state of affairs these days that we have to be dealing with these terribly anti-immigrant laws.
The worst of every country is coming into our country.
We have an incredibly complicated, complex, and broken immigration system.
If they choose to come without permission and against the law, they'll be restricted from receiving asylum.
Es difícil porque prácticamente es como que si le rompieran los sueños a uno. Porque uno viene con una meta, con ganas de ayudar a la familia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to At America's Edge, Border Politics, Police, and People. I'm Rebecca Blumenstein. I'm the head of editorial for NBC News, and I'm honored to be here with just an incredible panel today to discuss both immigration and migration. Voters have consistently ranked immigration as their first or second priority, along with the economy. And in the past 2 or 3 years, I think that we can all agree that there's been a marked shift in the debate about immigration. We've started seeing tens of thousands of migrants in New York City, in Chicago, and Atlanta, and places all around the country. And tougher immigration policy is no longer just a talking point for the right. Just in the past 2 weeks, there have been 2 major executive actions on immigration. And here to get a deeper understanding of the contours of the debate is really an all-star cast of major players on immigration policy who represent voices across a political spectrum in the United States and the world. I'm honored to introduce our panel. I have encouraged them all, I have to tell you, to have a very dynamic discussion. We're going to open it up to you for questions, and then we will take it from there. So to get started, Representative Dan Crenshaw hails from the 2nd Congressional District in Texas, the Houston area, and also plays a major role on immigration and the debate in Congress, is chief of the Task Force to Combat Mexican Cartels, and I will also note had a very noteworthy and fabled 10-year career in the military with the Navy SEALs, saw 5 overseas assignments, and returned with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Navy Medal of Honors. Thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce Marcelo Escobar, President Biden's top migration advisor as a special assistant to the president and coordinator of the LA Declaration for Migration, which she promises to explain to us. Previously, she had a high-ranking position heading up migration for USAID and also served in the Obama-Biden administration, where, among other things, you pushed for the U.S. support for the Peace Pact in Colombia. Great to have you here as well. I'd next like to introduce David Miliband, a voice who may be familiar to many of you. He is president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which oversees development efforts and crisis relief in no less than 40 countries that are designated crisis countries, which you can explain to us. Previously served as Foreign Secretary of the UK and was a longtime member of Parliament. Thank you for being here, David. And last but not least, Jonathan Blitzer, a staff writer for The New Yorker who's long written about issues of immigration very deeply and is the author of Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, the United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. Thank you for being here, Jonathan. So just to start, I thought it would be good to kind of level set and get a grounding for all of us, to ask all the panelists, do you believe fundamentally that immigration is good for the country, is good for the world, and really what's changed? Let's go down the row here. Representative Crenshaw?
Sure. So it's a basic question of whether immigration is good for the country. I'm assuming we're meaning illegal immigration in an orderly fashion where people wait in line and there's some kind of merit to each of those applications, and it's designed to be beneficial to the United States as opposed to just be excessively compassionate to anyone who wants to come here, then yes, immigration is a good thing. We do need more workers. We have a shortage of from all sorts of workers, from high skill to low skill. So there's lots of reasonable changes that could be made there. Even President Trump is like running towards the center on this and talking about green cards for university graduates. But there should be no debate over whether illegal immigration is okay or not okay. No matter who they are, why they're even coming, they're cutting in line. Right? I think we were talking earlier and talked about Houston being one of the most diverse cities in America, the second most diverse city in America. I know a lot of legal immigrants. I think they hate illegal immigration more than your average American does because they did it the right way and it really frustrates them. My stepmom is one of them, of course. So if we're defining it that way, then yes. You know, it's like I ask you, hey, is it a good thing for you to have a house party? You're going to ask a few questions. You're going to be like, well, what time? Who's coming? Like, can you give me a guest list? And how many people exactly? Are they bringing things? Are they going to eat out of my fridge? Like, you're going to ask a few questions before you just open your door. And I think the same is true of immigration. I think that's not a controversial thing to say at all.
Marcella.
Well, the data is conclusive that migration is positive, but well managed. And I think this is the issue where the data and the politics are the furthest apart. And I think we should, and it's the reason I joined the White House a couple months ago, we can and should be able to bridge that gap. And it is a manageable problem. This is not the first time that we face spikes in our land and sea borders. 1950s, we had 1 million Mexican workers who were coming into the U.S. irregularly to come work in farms. 1990s with boats, with Cubans. 2 years ago, because I lived this, 1,000 Ukrainians were coming in between ports of entry in our border. And we know what's the recipe that works. And it is a combination of increased enforcement with a significant increase in alternatives, in lawful pathways for people to come regularly and legally. There is something different this time, and that is that we have 9.8 million people that have been displaced in Latin America, and that have moved borders. So just the sheer size is different this time. And I think that requires one added leg of the stool to work, and that is working with our neighboring countries who are absorbing over 85% of these migrants to help them stabilize, integrate migrants, and this is what we've been trying to do. And of course, continuing to address the root causes. So I do think we can bridge that gap, and I think we can be a country of laws and a country of immigrants.
David.
So I'll build on what the two previous speakers have said. Around the world, we know that in the famous phrase, immigrants get things done. And the statistics back it up and the anecdotes back it up. What I'll be talking about, I think in all my answers over the next 45 minutes or so, is that immigration is a national choice, and immigration policy is a national choice that needs to be made on social, economic, cultural, political grounds. There's a separate set of issues about asylum and refugees, where there are international legal responsibilities as well as moral responsibilities. And I run a humanitarian organization that works in 40 countries as well as working in 30 US offices. And the moral case as well as the legal situation of the baker from Damascus whose house is bombed by the Russians is different than the moral and legal case of someone who wants to come for a better life to America. And it seems to me that in your video, or in the video that was you saw here, it was really only about the southern border. It wasn't about the first set of issues around what kind of immigration policy does America want, because it's grown from 250 million people in 1990 to 340 million, 350 million people today. In the main, that's an immigration question. There's a separate set of questions about refugees, asylum seekers, where do they come from? There's 120 million people in the world who are on the run from conflict and disaster at the moment. They can't all come to America. And so there's a global question about how to uphold the rights of those who do have a fear of persecution at home and those who don't. And we need to get that separate and clear, because otherwise, I mean, in our experience as an NGO, in my own political experience, in countries where issues of immigration and issues of asylum are mixed up, It's bad for immigrants, it's bad for asylum seekers, it's bad for the country. It never gets resolved. You have to have a clear set of moral and political judgments about the immigration that you want and about how you're going to treat the legal rights of people to claim asylum and to have their asylum claim processed.
So you would carve a very different path for someone, the political persecution, who's being persecuted in their home country versus someone who wants a better life economically.
Yes, there's a different legal status that they have, and it's not illegal versus legal. It's a legal right to put their claim and to have it assessed. Now, at the moment, it takes 6 years to assess that claim in the United States. It takes 6 to 10 weeks in Germany. If you process the claims fast, you've got a chance of running an effective system that sends the right messages about those with the right kind of claims.
Jonathan.
I think there's a paradox in all of this, and this gets to your point, which is, the policy logjam in terms of opening up legal avenues for people to come to the United States results from a kind of political emphasis, obsession over the border. And there's a kind of catch-22 in all of this, because where there needs to be reform of the legal immigration system writ large to open up pathways for people to come lawfully in an orderly fashion, the political response has tended to be, look, we can't deal with wholesale reform of the system until we get the southern border in order. And yet, one of the reasons why the southern border seems to be so disordered, one of the reasons why the numbers seem to be so high and seem to be so unmanageable, leaving aside just for a moment all of the global factors that are driving them, and of course we can't understand that without the global context, is the fact that people don't have other avenues to use to enter the United States. And so you have this deep intermixing of these different policy channels that are kind of, they're crossed through the politics. And no one really politically has any incentive to get these different lines cleared. And, I want to add just one thing. In 2014, the United States saw, I would say for the first time in recent memory, very clearly, a so-called humanitarian crisis at the southern border, when tens of thousands of unaccompanied children and families from Central America showed up seeking protection. Now, by law, they had the right to seek protection. And of course, there is a statute that dictates how the U.S. government must respond when someone arrives seeking protection. And it has to do with forms of pure persecution based on their identity. From 2014 roughly to the present moment, we have lived with a policy conundrum in the form of the asylum system, which is that we know that large numbers of people who show up at the southern border are very much in need. They're driven by a real sense of urgency and desperation, and yet, by the strict terms of what they're seeking at the southern border, they may not qualify for asylum. The statute itself is very specific. So to take a real-life example of someone who is very much someone who we should be thinking about as a human being, but who may not fall under a kind of classic category of persecution, is someone whose home has been upended, say, in a tropical storm as a result of climate change, or someone who can't grow crops in a rural region in Central America because of climate change. That person, by the strict dictates of asylum law, isn't being persecuted. And yet we know that person is suffering from a very acute need. And so the U.S., until it starts to think more dramatically about how to open up the wider legal immigration system to accommodate people under these circumstances, is always going to be trapped in this sort of circular path of pointing to the border, throwing up their hands in Washington, and not really making any progress.
And you take me to my very next question. I think we'll start with you, Marcella. The political paralysis that now exists in the U.S. on this issue. I mentioned the 2 executive actions that President Biden took recently. Is he sending mixed messages here, in a sense, putting a limit on the number of asylum seekers while also opening a pathway for undocumented spouses to become citizens?
No, I think what he's trying to do, and we were discussing this, is, as you were mentioning, the system is broken, and it's sending the wrong incentives to people. So when the border is overwhelmed, and it takes 6 years for people to be processed, it creates a loophole, and people are coming and using that loophole, and it becomes a selling point for smugglers. So it's untenable. So the executive order on making generally people who come and claim asylum ineligible in between ports of entry was a tough decision for the president and one that he did not take lightly. But there were solutions. There was a border bill with sufficient funding to be able to respond and be able to have this fast processing of asylum claims. And in that respect, I do want to congratulate and thank the congressman because well, at least you wanted the bill to be looked at for its merits. And I do think that we could use more of that in Congress. But Congress didn't act, so the president had to act. And then on the second executive order, that is providing people who have been here for decades just the capacity to get out of this limbo in legality. But ideally, we would have legislation and resources to be able to deal with this problem.
Representative Crenshaw, when the bipartisan bill died, you were quoted as criticizing your GOP colleagues for unethical behavior. Where do you stand on the bill and really efforts at bipartisanship on this issue at this point?
Yeah, I don't know if I used the word unethical. I said it was stupid to have an opinion before you've read something. I mean, I think that's a pretty non-controversial thing to say. You have to understand the politics around immigration law, though. First of all, immigration law is complicated, and it invites a lot of emotion. There's a lot of senators and congressmen that have scars on their backs from trying to negotiate these deals over the years. There's a lot of outside groups that have a lot of interest in destroying any kind of deal. A lot of people blame Washington for that, like, oh, politicians just want this political football. That might be true for some. For the most part, though, we have plenty of political footballs that we can throw around. And it's much more about the outside groups on the left and the right that their only reason for being is immigration, whether it's pro-immigration or anti-immigration. They make all their money off of that. So they have a lot of incentive to try and disrupt any kind of negotiation. There were some problems, I think, with the way they did that deal. It was all in secret. They didn't do a good job building outside support so that there was some conversations happening because they wanted to keep it secret. Look, there's some benefits to that. There's some cons to that. The problem is if you design a super complicated immigration bill, and it was very complicated, and you're trying to explain extremely complicated policy issues, trying to explain what the current law is versus how the law would change because of this bill, you've already lost the discussion in a very heated political environment. I don't think it should have happened in the Senate either. And I blame us in the House for this, for not saying, look, we're the majority in the House. We're going to negotiate directly with the White House the way we did with the debt ceiling negotiations. We got a lot of what we wanted on that. And I remind my fellow conservatives of that. My goal is to win. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat on reforming the border policy, especially immigration law, whether it's asylum reform or the paroling authority that I think is deeply abused, and Flores settlement agreement, things like this. But you actually have to sit down in the right environment and get it done. I want to respond to one thing, which is when we talk about immigration more generally, it's important that we don't operate from this false premise that just because somebody wants to be here, we have to create a pathway for them. That seems to be the premise that is often operated from, and that's just not true. There's an infinite number of people who would be in this country if we let them, because it's the best place to be. And there's plenty of polling data on this. I mean, we have like, I don't know, less than 100,000 special immigrant visas, or the lottery system visas that we allow every year. Like 9 million people apply for those. So do you think 9 million people should just get in? I'm sure they're nice people, but there is a line, and we have to have some kind of process, and it has to be slower than just letting everyone in at the same time. I don't see any other way to do it, and I think you have to understand that perspective from people who do say, yeah, we do have to solve the border crisis before we actually think about, giving amnesty to people who came here illegally. Of course we have to. You've got a boat that's leaking, and all you're talking about is reforms to the boat. You're not talking about the hole in it. And just politically, and you can have a different opinion on that, but politically speaking, that's not an opinion. That's an observable fact. So you will never get this done. You will never buy the political goodwill to have whatever you want to believe is comprehensive immigration reform. There's a lot of definitions of that. You'll never even get there until you've actually secured the problem that is driving everyone nuts that you just saw on TV there at the southern border. That's a political reality that you can't escape.
David, what is your view? Not that you're based in New York, you're not exactly the outside looking in, but looking at this debate
So we look
on
at this
stage
both,
here.
I mean, we look at this both in the US, but also in Europe and in the countries in crisis. I think there are two things that are really important. First of all, let's remember that 75% of the people fleeing from conflict stop in the next door country to where they're coming from. So people from Sudan, which is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today, they stop in Chad or in South Sudan. Now, to the southern border, we've talked so far as if there are two sets of players in this. One set of players in the federal government and its agents and its civil servants, and then a second set of players, people who are trying to come here. There's a third set of players, and I think I want to put a point on something that Jonathan said. The absence of legal routes, restricted, demarcated, clear, the absence of legal routes in which you can apply to come, empower a third set of actors. And the third set of actors are obviously the people smugglers. And this is true for the US, it's also true very significantly in Europe as well, where if you, and Europe only until this year has the European Union had any kind of asylum and migration pact. It's just been agreed among the 27 countries. So there was no, there were national fragmented offers, but there was no legal system where people could place their claim. That has simply empowered the people smugglers. And until we understand that this is a three-dimensional game, not just a two-dimensional game, we're really going to struggle.
If I can add to that for the problem that we are facing right now, to put it in perspective, if people think, how many people migrate? What would be the number that you would throw out? That are born in one place and end up someplace else? Give me some numbers. 10%. And what is it? 80 million people. Okay, but what percentage of the world? And even from south to south, even doesn't need to come from a developed country. It has gone from 2% to 3%. So most people stay, and then the rest move to the neighboring country when there's conflict. And that is what we're seeing in Latin America. Like these 9.8 million people that are moved, 7.7 million of them coming from one country, Venezuela, that has lost 25% of their population, have moved to 4 countries in South America that are absorbing and actually have some of the most pragmatic and generous policies of integration. When they settle, they don't tend to make the trek up. Actually, when we look at people and survey them in the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia, less than 5% of those that are moving north have legal status elsewhere in the region. So these policies are part of the equation. And we don't have to create legal pathways to the extent that people want them for irregular migration to go to zero. Those examples of the Bracero program in the 50s or Ukraine, like we did not create legal pathways to the million people, but we created reasonable alternatives. People don't want to come here illegally. So if you increase enforcement and say, we will turn you back if you come irregularly, but here are these avenues, most people will take them. And that's the equation that we should be implementing.
And I want to emphasize something because, you know, it's easy to sort of spin out folksy metaphors about how the immigration system can work, and you have to, you know, plug a leaky boat if you want to deal with the broader system and so on. You know, the reality, honestly, is that it's a false choice to somehow imply that either you have to be harsh at the southern border or completely permissive. One of the things that I think has been particularly innovative about the Biden administration, and it's been a mixed bag and there have definitely been missteps, has been a series of parole programs that target specifically countries that have seen real jumps in emigration in recent years. So Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba. And one of the ideas of some of these policies was to recognize the fact, the inevitability of how many people are uprooted in this region. And these pathways that the U.S. can start to create isn't an alternative to other pathways in other countries. What it is a kind of safety valve. It's a way of managing a global reality. And so for these 4 countries, within the first 6 months of the implementation of a new parole program that allowed basically 30,000 people from each of these countries to come to the United States in a legal fashion with a sponsor waiting on the U.S. side of the border, the percentage in arrivals from these 4 countries at the southern border dropped by 90%.
By 90%.
Which is just to say, you know, there are ways of combining a kind of compassionate outlook with a baseline pragmatism that actually does address some of the more complicated realities in the world and doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be altogether too permissive in addressing real global needs.
We talk a lot about addressing the root causes of what prompt people to leave. And Marcela, you were talking about how the Biden administration, to take that point a step further, is invested or spent about $3 billion with governments in Latin America to help them absorb the influx, particularly of Venezuelans. Representative Crenshaw, do you support such an effort? And obviously you're very focused on Mexico, and the former president has talked about, if necessary, declaring war on Mexico and sending all the migrants back. I mean, what would your approach be in terms of the root causes here?
Let's clarify. He's never said he's going to declare war on Mexico. We've talked about military action against the cartels in conjunction with Mexican forces, something we do a little bit of now. We should do a lot more of it because cartels need to know that we're coming after them and that we're pissed. And all of this is about incentives. We can talk all day long about the complicated nature of the world, which has been complicated literally since its inception of civilization. That's all fine and good. And you can deride my words as what did you say, folksy. That's fine. Reality is still reality, and incentives still matter. So let's take a few steps back to everything that was said here. I think I have the most agreement with David over here because he keeps trying to distinguish between these folks with legal claims to come into a country and those without. Here's the thing about, we look at our asylum claim data, for instance, from people especially coming from Mexico and Northern Triangle countries, Central America. When it's all said and done, after they've made it in and they've gotten caught or let's say processed and released, when it's all said and done, when they get adjudicated, you're looking at less than 10% positive adjudication rates for asylum. So let's just be honest about what's going on here. You have a lot of economic claims. There are people who just don't like where they live and they want to move. I have sympathy for that, but we can't take everybody. We do have laws in place to accept people who are persecuted by their own government. That's the whole point of an asylum claim. Mm-hmm. But we do have to call the bluff at a certain point. And look, I'll work with Democrats. One of my friends, Vicente Gonzalez, who co-chairs the cartel task force with me, he's got a bill I agree with. We should have asylum claims be processed in our embassies and consulates or bases in their home country. If you really feel you have an asylum claim, why wouldn't you go to the quickest place that you can get it? Why would you even cross illegally between ports of entry? Why wouldn't you just go to a port of entry? We have to call the bluff. Why were you even going through Mexico? Mexico's a safe third country. So you can't let in everybody. You have to have some rules. And here's the thing. If you're really that compassionate, be compassionate for the people that actually have asylum claims. It does take too long to get that process. And there are people with legitimate asylum claims. And we are favoring the people who do it illegally, who have a geographic advantage or pay off human smugglers to get here because we've allowed that system to be abused and abused and abused over and over again. It's really important to nail that point home. Your original question, though, I've kind of forgotten it at this point.
You answered it fine.
Okay.
Marcela, could you just talk a little bit in detail about the neighboring countries in Latin America and the Biden administration effort there and in Mexico? Is it in line with Representative Crenshaw? Do you guys agree on?
Yeah, I don't think we disagree on that. Should we help Mexico? I'm big on helping Mexico. It should be our number one ally. If we care about one country being the most prosperous and safest place in the world, it's 1,000% Mexico.
Look, I think the point is that we do know, because this is not the first time that we have these spikes of irregular migration, how to manage it. The problem is the politics, right? And yet, despite the politics, I think we are doing a lot of the right policies. And that is what President Biden tried to do with this LA Declaration, which part of my title, and it's an agreement that President Biden signed with 20 other countries within the region and said, this is not a problem in our southwest border only. This is a regional problem, and it's kind of the most typical problem of the commons. If we all just try to work on it in our borders, it's going to make it worse for all of us and the 9 million people who are in a state of vulnerability. But if we all work together on these three pillars, increased enforcement, and we have increased enforcement. Our collaboration with Mexico is closer than ever. We have worked together on both sides of the border, and it has decreased irregular migration by 40% in the last 4 months. We've also expanded our sharing of biometric data throughout the region so that we can tell whether there's nefarious actors coming to any of our borders. And that kind of, we have gone after charter companies, we have gone after smugglers. The level of collaboration and going after those that are trying to traffic on and prey on vulnerable migrants is increased, and we're seeing the benefits. Lawful pathways. The president has increased through CHNV and CBP1 1 million slots for people since January 2023 to come orderly and legally into this country, and that has dramatically decreased irregular migration. But the third piece, and that's the one with regional engagement, which is related to root causes. Root causes and the work that we do in the region, it pays off, and we have tested that it makes a difference. When we help a farmer whose farm is, got hit by rust and won't have an income, if we help them in advance, they don't flee. And we have example after example of that. At the same time, we have these shocks, like with Venezuela. So what's happening right now is this work within countries where, again, Colombia is an incredible example for the world. I think it'll end up in the history books. They have given 2.5 million migrants that are coming from Venezuela legal status, 10-year legal status in their country, right? You can use our healthcare, you can put your kids to school, you can get work here. And usually these policies, we know that in the end, absorbing these migrants and legalizing them will mean a 4.5 increase in GDP for these countries. But the cost is today. But if you do them boldly, that actually shortens. And you have seen places like Bogota where now these migrants have created 200,000 jobs, have started to pay for their own health care, have provided $600 million of income. So those policies, which used to be Colombia, is now over half of the countries in the LA Declaration. And we have been, with this funding, been able to be right behind them because we know that a migrant that settles in these countries is one less migrant that is coming up north and having to put themselves at risk. So that is the strategy, and that's where we're trying to push amidst the noise of the political moment.
David.
Can I just come in? For us in the West, whether you're in Europe or in America, there's one easy thing we're not doing, and there's one very difficult thing that we've got to figure out how to do. The easy thing we're not doing is supporting the states that are hosting the vast bulk of people who are fleeing conflict and disaster at the moment. And we are multiplying the chance that they're going to end up trying to come to Europe or trying to get into the United States. There's a $45 billion humanitarian gap just for humanitarian funding around the world. And in 2023, because interest rates went up in the richer parts of the world, they went up even more in the poorer parts of the world. $200 billion came out of emerging economies to pay to creditors. It was found by raiding education budgets, welfare budgets, etc., in the poorest parts of the world. So we're cutting off our nose out to spite our face for something relatively simple, because we know if you don't invest in humanitarian efforts abroad, you're creating a petri dish for political instability and for movement. The second thing is a much harder thing. There are 55, 56, quote-unquote, civil wars, civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment. Inside Sudan is the paradigmatic case at the moment. The fact that people are fleeing from Sudan to one of the poorest countries in the world, South Sudan, should tell you everything about what's going wrong with international diplomacy. The truth is, the international diplomatic system has been left completely unable to cope with these civil wars. Syria is a very good example. The rules of diplomacy, I used to be in this world, the rules of diplomacy around state sovereignty, around international law, aren't working in these 50-plus conflicts. And if we want to think about this structurally, we've got to get to grips with that, because the climate is actually a multiplier of conflict, which then leads to people moving. The number of pure climate refugees is relatively small. People move within their own country when they're affected by the climate crisis. But this diplomatic crisis of a mushrooming number of unresolved conflicts is actually going to be the bane, ultimately, of the migration system. And that's where I think your question about root cause, if we're honest about it, it's beyond the reach of a humanitarian agency. You've got to swim upstream towards much deeper questions of geopolitics if we're going to get to grips with that.
It's such a staggering number of conflicts around the world. Jonathan, you've written in the past, it's not just to return to the border, our original theme here, it's not really U.S. or Mexico, it's U.S. and Mexico, and you've made the observation that the more we try to enforce it, it just increases really the tension between the two countries. Could you expound on that?
I mean, the experience I've had reporting primarily in Central America has been that you go out in the world and you see how kind of stark and in some ways inapplicable the kind of legal and political terms are policing immigration law in people's actual lives. So, the premise of immigration law is, it's obviously very complex and there are a lot of moving pieces. But the idea is it presupposes these very intelligible dividing lines between who qualifies for what sort of legal avenues exist, who's a citizen of which country. But one of the consequences of the deeper history of U.S. involvement in the wider region, of just the nature of how people live in the world, of all of the ways in which social media reduces some of these distances, all kinds of cultural overlap between different places, is that the reality I often found, particularly in the borderlands, but also heading farther south, is that there's often more of a third term that predominates. It's not the U.S. or Mexico per se, it's this kind of blend of the two. Or you could find yourself in San Salvador in 2016, having a conversation with someone who'd been deported, who will talk in kind of granular detail about LA in the early 1980s. Or you could be in the Western Highlands of Guatemala and be talking about the suburbs of New Jersey. I mean, the interconnectedness plays out in this way. And I realize from a political and a policy standpoint, I don't know that you're ever going to be able to capture the kind of complexity or the messiness or all of the human entanglements intended therein. But I do think that it certainly should raise our sense of moral responsibility and deep thinking about kind of what it means to legislate on this issue. I mean, the last time, I realize this conversation has primarily dealt with issues of asylum and migration, and these are global things, and we're in a moment of kind of world historical migration, the likes of which we've really not seen since the Second World War. Obviously, this affects countries all over the world, but through it all, there are some inescapable facts that all, to my mind, lead sadly back to the intractability of politics. When was the last time the U.S. made any meaningful reform to its immigration system? 1990. The world has changed 1,000 times over since then. And so, you go out in the world and you encounter people and you talk even to border agents and people who staff these government agencies who are not like me, bleeding heart liberals, but who are pragmatists, who themselves are kind of overwhelmed by how a lot of the logjam could at least be alleviated just by some sort of basic agreement about funding, about resources. But again, this all leads back to politics. There's no escaping it. I don't know how we ever escape that in this conversation.
So the time is passing very quickly. We're going to open it up for questions. But before we do that, I promised a discussion about potential solutions. And a couple of you have offered them. So I'd also like to just offer you a chance to talk about things that you think are not well understood. Marcella, you talked about labor. We've had a spate of crimes here in the U.S. Where people accused are undocumented migrants. Representative Crenshaw, what are your thoughts of what are we missing here?
So many thoughts. Okay. First, let me give you the Republican response to the Biden administration saying that they're doing a lot on this issue. Our response, generally speaking, and I think the people we represent would say it's too little too late. We had 3 years of 8 million encounters at the border, record-breaking encounters constantly. To put that in perspective, Ellis Island, over its 62-year history, had 12 million. So we're on track to meet that, except just in 4 years. So too little, too late. And what's different? Well, it's an election year. What's different? This is a very unpopular issue with anybody. Nobody wants to see those images that you showed earlier in this presentation. This is indeed about the southern border. This panel, and so the other problem we have with it, and why I don't have a huge problem with the executive order that was just passed on asylum reform. I want to see how it's implemented. It's too early to tell. It was just passed this month. But there is a shell game that takes place. And what I've noticed from the Biden administration is that they don't necessarily want to stop the flow in, they just want to clean it up so it doesn't look like that. And so when you have the CBP-1 app allowing 1,500 people in every single day, they're still cutting the line. How is that different? I have friends I went to high school with in Colombia. Okay? I lived in Colombia for 4 years, 1998, 2002. I have seen what a country can go through over the last 20 plus, God, I'm getting old, 26 years. My friends can't get visas. These are highly educated people who own businesses. They can barely get tourist visas, let alone business visas. But a CBP-1 app, you just show up at the border, done. How is that fair? How is that compassionate? Under the other paroling programs, which I think are illegal, because our statute is very clear. You parole specific people for specific reasons. There isn't some statute that says you can mass parole everybody. I think that's been largely misinterpreted. Indeed, it's being used for all of these different countries. You mentioned crime, and they'll say, well, it's very unlikely immigrants commit crime. Well, how much is too much? You can talk to me about percentages all day long. Well, guess what? If you're allowing millions of people in, yeah, I get it. The percentage of bad ones gets smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm not going to fall for that shell game. Just recently, in the last week in Houston, we have a 12-year-old girl lured out by Venezuelan immigrants and murdered. The same thing happened with another, there's so many, I have a whole list here if we want to really go into it. But the other thing to note here on criminality, Border Patrol just in this fiscal year has encountered 14,000 criminals at the border. OFO encountered 13,000. That's not nothing. That is not nothing. It might be a small percentage of the millions that we're encountering, but it's not nothing. It's also worth noting, even with the successes, and we have seen decreases in illegal immigration in the last few weeks, largely, I think, because of Mexico's actions. I applaud the Biden administration for going down to Mexico in December. Anthony Blinken went down, and he made some deal with Mexico. I don't know what. But Mexico started changing the way they do business. I don't know why. We don't know why. Maybe you can tell us. Some deal got struck. They started deporting people back to the southern areas of Mexico. They started tackling the problem of thousands of migrants using trains to get in. They started doing a lot. I don't know why. That has still only brought it down to 180,000 a month. By the way, the height under Trump was 144,000 under the crisis that Trump dealt with, a different kind of crisis. Keep in mind, why did that happen? That's because of the Flores settlement agreement that got changed in 2015. It's a court case that made it so that if you brought a kid with you, if you brought a minor with you, you get automatic access into the country. A lot of people used advantage of that. That's why there was a crisis under Trump the first few years. They fixed it by, again, making a deal with Mexico, remain Mexico policy. So what do you need to do to fix it? Sorry, I know I'm going over time, but real quick, asylum reform, we've beat that dead horse, okay? I think you understand what I stand for there. You shouldn't be able to claim asylum in between ports of entry. You shouldn't be able to go through all these third countries and claim asylum when you've gone through third safe countries. You should be able to claim asylum in your home country. There should be higher credible fear standards when that first meeting with somebody, when they say they're claiming asylum. They get coached by the cartels on what exactly to say so that they get through into the system and they get notices to appear 6 months or 6 years later. And then it adjudicates negative, but they don't even show up. On the parole, that statute needs to be crystal clear. You cannot just parole everybody. Parole was never meant for mass paroling of people. A lot of the people that were getting caught and released into the country under the Biden administration, they're not even claiming asylum. They're just given notices to appear under the paroling program. They don't even have to abuse the asylum process. And then you have to fix Flores, right? You have to have genetic testing. If somebody's if a minor's claiming that they have a sponsor, we have to actually look into that. We have to actually look into whether they're really relatives and whether that relative or sponsor has some kind of criminal history. You know, this is about protecting kids. Kids are trafficked under this system, massively so. Kids are often recycled a lot because kids are used to let adults in. All of these things are huge problems, and there are solutions.
Marcelo, let's have you respond, and then I want to open it up real quickly for a couple of questions.
Lots of points that the congressman brought. One, Mexico is working with us because we're in this together. The same issues that I described that are causing, we used to have 1.5 million people that moved. We have 9.8. They're in it with us, and they know that working together is the only way to have sustainable solutions. Crime. Those are horrendous crimes. They should be prosecuted at the fullest extent of the law. We know all the data is conclusive. The crime rates of migrants and undocumented and documented migrants are lower than native populations. And there was a recent study in Texas literally months ago of this. But we also know that sensationalist news cells. We train people in Colombia on how to report on crimes, not to mention nationalities. They mention nationalities to stoke xenophobia and hate and fear-mongering. Maybe we could use your help to train our reporters here. In terms of what the crimes are real. It's just
crimes are real. I have a whole list.
Of course,
I mean,
but
it's not sensationalized.
Right? No, but it is sensationalized because if you know that percentage-wise it's less, the reason you have to say it comes from this person, this place, or this place is to say, oh yes, I'm under attack. Oh, it's the other that caused this, and it creates this fear that. That's not our problem.
I think the context is important.
Right. The context, I think citizens have an understandable anger when somebody commits, so let's say you hit somebody with your car, but you were driving normal. Okay, you didn't do anything wrong. You weren't drunk driving, but you hit somebody with their car. Is everyone angry about that? A little. But what if you were drunk driving? People are really angry with you about it. And our laws are angrier with you about it. There's a different consequence. And so people understandably get angrier when you were here legally, let loose by our system, and then kill somebody. That's what I'll leave it there.
In terms of solutions, I think one that is a no-brainer and is part of the history of this is expanding labor migration, labor pathways. I mean, we have worked with the countries in Central America. They have, and I've been part of these programs where they have databases of people with the skills that they want to go to Alaska to help with fishing and farming, to do landscaping. And guess what? They want to come legally. They want to be able to come, and I've met one. They want to come with their passport, go work, be valued for the work, not seen as criminals, and then come back to their communities and see their children and actually bring their skills and some money. And we benefit from that. We are at the lowest unemployment rate in 80 years. We have 1.4 vacancies for every unemployed person in America. We need that labor. We want it to be regular. We want it to be legal. And we need to expand these paths.
We have areas of agreement, areas of disagreement. I have time for like 1 or 2 questions, and then we're just going to ask our panel to wrap up. There's a microphone runner somewhere.
We do like 3 separate questions.
What? Yeah. We'll do 3 separate questions, and then our panelists will wrap up. Thank you.
I have questions, but also a little bit of a comment, if that's okay.
No, just a question, please. We're totally out of time.
All right. Well, my first thing I want to say is thank you, Jonathan, for your book. It was a significant, important book and a great contribution to our understanding. I just, I only have comments, so I won't take your time.
Okay, thank you. Could you hand him the microphone? There.
Representative Crenshaw, you're kind of the only one in this room, I think, who has the ability to affect change, with your vote. I mean, we obviously all have votes. But is it reasonable for us to assume that in the first 6 months of 2025, Congress is going to fix this?
Okay, and then one other question to wrap up over there, and we'll just do a round robin to wrap things up. And we'll let you answer that question.
Congressman Crenshaw, I've got kind of a threefold question. What is the estimated number of children that have come across the border and sold into sex trafficking? Also, what is the estimated number of terrorists coming over our border? And then the last one, drug smuggling statistics.
Okay.
So why don't we go down the line and wrap up with concluding thoughts from our panelists. We promised a dynamic discussion, and we've had one. Representative Crenshaw.
I'll be super quick. So is it reasonable to believe Congress will act? That largely depends on elections. I don't know what the majorities are going to be. That depends a lot on that. It does look like Trump's going to win. If the election was held today, it looks like Trump is going to win. It looks like we keep the House. It looks like we take the Senate. That's my best guess on what happens now. We still need 60 votes in the Senate to affect major change. So, and Democrats are going to be very much against anything Republicans want to do. So I don't see a ton of compromise happening. The good news is a lot of this is executive order. Biden rolled back all of Trump's executive orders on the border. A lot of those have to do with agreements with Central American countries, agreements with Mexico, all rolled back. Those will be rolled back in, I think, and so I think you'll see some progress, at least on the southern border issues. I was asking for these numbers on the sex trafficking before this panel. We just don't really have them. It's very hard to figure out. Some statistics say 1 out of 3, 60%. Amnesty International said something like 60-80%. Sex trafficking, that's a whole hour about like what it is, what it isn't, what's real, what isn't, how it's done, how these girls are tricked into it, how this actually happens, what sex trafficking means. That's a lot to unpack, but needless to say, a lot of it happens because the opportunity is there, and the cartels are the main purveyors of that. Terrorists, hundreds. I don't know I forget the exact number, but it's hundreds just these last couple of years. The FBI did an amazing operation in Pennsylvania recently, rolling up 8 Tajik nationals who were using a human trafficking network designed by ISIS Khorasan. They were, I can't say a whole lot more about it than that, but believe me, you wanted those guys rolled up. They got here illegally. The last thing is drugs. So, I mean, you're looking at like 25 million pounds of fentanyl smuggled into the U.S. My main reason for going after the cartels these last couple of years is because fentanyl. Fentanyl is literally killing people. It's a different drug problem than we've ever had before, and you deal with that by disincentivizing them to take on that business model, and you disincentivize cartels to do something by committing violence against them. And you need to do that along with the Mexican military. They already do it, but they need our support, and we need them to ask for our support. I don't blame the Biden administration on this one. Biden administration has been helpful. It's AMLO, the president of Mexico, who's been absolutely atrocious on this. I'm very much looking forward to a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and working with them. And I hope they'll be more pragmatic about that.
Marcella, and David, and John.
He answered the questions. What question?
Anything you want to say to wrap up? We're sadly out of time.
No, I think actually, I hope that what you can see is that we are not that far apart in what we know. We know what the solutions are, and I do think that there are more people that are willing to read the bill and to really be pragmatic about this issue. Like I said, we know what the answers are, and I do think that that Americans in general want legality, are incredibly generous, and I think if we put forth what it would take to solve this, I think we're going to get past kind of the noise and the fear-mongering around this topic, because it is a challenge, but it is a manageable challenge compared to others that we have.
David.
I would say whether you want people to be able to claim asylum or not, you should accept that this issue is manageable both for those who are coming across and those who are living here. And I just want to give one example of that. Tens of thousands of asylum seekers were on the streets of Phoenix 2 years ago because they were dumped at the coach station. The city and the state came to us and other NGOs and said, run a proper center to give people a health check, a legal check, and a transport to relatives around the country. You won't find an asylum seeker on the streets of Phoenix today. And this is manageable in the interests of the host communities and in the interests of the asylum seeker. If that was then added to a proper processing system, you'd be taking significant steps to actually bringing order to this process. Because although I run a humanitarian agency, there's no humanitarianism with disorder. It's the antithesis of it. And I think that should be a shared goal wherever you're coming from on this process.
And Jonathan.
It's an interesting conversation for me to be a part of as a journalist, because I'm not typically, involved in a kind of back and forth on like very granular policies, although I'm pretty steeped in them on a day-to-day level. And I am, frankly, often in the position of writing about the fact that it is easier to campaign on this issue and to be sort of pithy and critical of, frankly, any administration that's having to deal with the complexity of this, whether it's Democratic or Republican, because it is an intractable problem. And there are solutions. And I actually do think, it's complicated to hear some of the disagreement here, because I actually think if we were to get into some of the granular stuff, so like you hear reference to something like the Flores Agreement, I actually think we would all agree on some of the particulars of that. And there's a whole history on that. There could be a separate hour after the sex trafficking panel. You could listen to a separate hour on the Flores panel. But I just think that there's the alternatives of what we're facing down if this issue does manage to scare people is something that is beyond the band of reasonableness that you're even hearing in this conversation. And so, this has been widely reported. People in the Trump campaign, frankly, have been explicit about it. The plans under consideration involve mass roundups, involve the demolition of the legal immigration system. It's a much more radical action than the critique of the kind of operations that you hear presupposes. And so I would just want to end on that note of caution.
I want you to join me in thanking our panel for a very eye-opening and important discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.